Hey fearsome friends, bolt those doors, lock those windows, and close those curtains, especially at night, as it's time to get cozy, comfy, warm, and to let your nightmares in. I don't think I've ever been anti-gun, but my dad definitely had the Mexican version of a FUD mentality. I bought a Mosin at 18 for under $200 for hog hunting, and actually landed 2 successful trips with that rifle before upgrading, but it was the only firearm in the house when I was 20. I'd moved back in after switching jobs to help out my parents during a financial slump, where my mother was working nights and my father was working out of town. One night my sister came into my room and shook my arm. I had gaming headphones on. I now almost exclusively play with one earmuff on my ear, and she said that there was a monster in the backyard. I was in the middle of a game, so I didn't want to scoot her back to her bed, so I told her to sit on mine until I finished my game. Then I heard it. It was a loud crack coming from our den area. I took a peek out of my window and could just barely make out the shape of a man against the side of our house. I gave the phone to my sister and told her to call 911. She was young, but she knew our address and just needed to tell them that someone was trying to break in. I heard another crack, and it sounded like he'd be in any second. I grabbed 10 rounds and loaded 5 into the Mosin and racked it. I should have posted up in the den, but in my panicked brain I decided to get to him before he got in. He was a dirty old tweaker, mumbling to himself when I got there, so I yelled at him to stop, as he'd broken my mum's bench and was trying to crowbar my back door. I guess I'd always thought that I'd be okay, as at least I had the gun, but a Mosin is an awful idea for any home. It's big, it's heavy, and over-penetration is a huge problem, as my aim was shaking like a leaf. He yelled back without looking at me, saying, "That bitch needs to let me in and get my things." He didn't know where he was or what he was doing, so I told him if he broke in any further, I'd shoot him. Then he said something like, "What the?" And right then he noticed I had a rifle pointed at him. His eyes became wide and he immediately started trying to get me to calm down. We got into an argument about who needed to be calm, and I told him to walk back the way he came. I was super conscious of the fact that not only did I not want to shoot this guy, but if I had to, I didn't want it to sail through him into the house where my siblings were. I shot 2 pigs and maybe a coyote at the time with that rifle, but it didn't prepare me to aim it at a person. I kept my sights on his gut and pelvis, so ideally the round would dig into the ground after him. I was scared of missing. The bolt on a Mosin is hard to work at a range, and if I missed, I may as well use it as a club. Luckily it never came to that, and he scuttled out the backyard door and ended up getting scooped up by the cops a few blocks down. I guess a couple of neighbors had heard us yelling and called too. The cop I spoke to said we were lucky, as he was in and out of jail with warrants on him already. Apparently he had a big knife on him as well. I think about that incident a lot, and remember he didn't care what I had to say until he saw the gun. Maybe he would have been intimidated by a bat, but I wouldn't roll those dice. I think about how if I'd had the wrong tool for the job, how I probably should have had that entire interaction from inside my home through the door that he was attempting to break in through. I think about how little knowledge I had about how to use that tool in a defensive capacity. I hope I never have to use these guns in this way, but they're there if I need them. It was the 4th time someone had either knocked rapidly on our front door and run off, or ding-dong-ditched during the evenings over a few months. My father spotted 2 college-age teenagers hiding in a big bush across the street, and yelled out that he'd seen them and he was going to attack the next time they tried something like it again. But they ran off before he could get close to them. Months later, I left my bedroom to get something late that evening. The blinds were closed, but the curtains were open, and right when I walked back in, someone knocked 3 times on my window. It took about a minute or less to get my father to go check it out, but no one was there. Every couple of months, this person would pick a different window of the house to knock on, as late as 4 in the morning, and they'd climbed over the backyard fence to do this. Now we're one of the 2 houses on the street that doesn't have a dog in the backyard. Once someone knocked on the little blurred window above our shower, whilst my dad was in there, and sometimes our cats would eye the windows weirdly at night before we would find out from another family member that day someone had knocked on a window later in the evening. Halloween night rolled around and I stayed up late because I had a feeling that out of all the nights for someone to be creepy, it was going to be then. Around 3 in the morning, I saw a tall shadow go past my window from the corner of my eye. And since I've had hypnagogic hallucinations before, I rubbed my eyes and stared at my window to make sure it wasn't my brain making things up. I saw a light and the shadow again. Then I realized that it was a flashlight from a phone, and this person was using it to look at the bottom of my window. I watched this person observe my window as I tried calling my parents a few times, but the phone calls weren't waking them up. I'd had surgery a few days before that, so it was a struggle to try to get off my bed and to get at least one of my parents. But by the time anyone could look outside, the person was gone. As far as we know, we haven't had any late-night visitors since, and without getting up too close and personal, it would be nice to know who is doing this and why. I don't know if it's the 2 college-age men or someone else. I'm a post-college graduate female, and my sister is probably the same age as the 2 men. We live in a badly guarded gate community in a small town, but there have been a couple of men creeping around during this time. A guy with a teardrop tattoo by his eye asked my mum if there was anything for men at our garage sale, but he backed off when my dad showed up, so I don't think it's him creeping around our house. Then there was a guy sitting outside of people's houses in his car, including ours. Someone else noticed and posted it on Facebook, and all 4 of our cars have been parked there each time, so I don't think it's a burglar. Whoever it was basically just ding-dong ditched, and that hasn't happened since my father threatened them. But his threat could have entertained them, and they could have taken it as a challenge. This challenge could be why they chose a different window to knock on each time they visited. It just really bothers me that it seems like this person is watching us. I don't like that they decided not to knock the last time, but to turn on their flashlight and look at the bottom of my window as if they're seeing if it can be opened from the outside. If they just wanted to get our attention and spook one of us, I'd assume they would have generally waved it around the middle of the window, not focus it across the bottom. And who knows, there may be multiple people guilty of these instances separately. I just hope they don't escalate from here. We've now got a camera doorbell, but they'd have to walk by it to be seen. So my fiancé, a 27-year-old male, and I, a 23-year-old female, are soon to be married and are remodeling an old family home. We started working on the house about 2 or 3 months ago, so my fiancé had bought a bunch of tools to use to renovate it. The house had been sitting empty for over a year. And keep in mind, the house is located in a fairly rural area, with a few houses and trailers here and there, but not too much traffic. Now we have a rodent problem, and have been setting traps to catch them. 3 weeks ago my fiancé went to check the traps, and we had a rat that was alive. Long story short, he didn't want to take care of it, so he left it. And when I got off work at 9 p.m. that night, I went over to the house to take care of the rat. It was raining, and my mum and brother came with me. I went to the back door and it was wide open, with rainwater blowing into the house. I was pissed. I thought my fiancé had left the door open, so I shut it and finished my business there. Later on, I asked my fiancé why he'd left the door open, and he claimed that he hadn't. I called bullshit and left it at that, but it didn't occur to me that somebody had possibly made a quick getaway. Fast forward to today, and my fiancé and I went to our house to throw a whole bunch of trash and stuff into the dumpster we'd rented. When we went inside, though, we immediately noticed that some things were missing. Drills, sanders, and other tools. They'd been stolen. We called my mother-in-law and told her what had happened, and she said we should make a police report. What scares me so much about this is that everything began to click with the rat trap incident. Somebody had been scoping us out. I would go to our house by myself on occasions, and always had a creepy vibe and felt watched. My little brother even remarked that he felt watched there, and asked if we were sure nobody was in there while we were gone. I noticed today when I was there alone that my dog was acting very nervously and suspicious. She wasn't running and playing like she usually does, and didn't want me to go to the backyard or wooded area. I'm glad I trusted her and my gut feeling. I don't know if the thieves were there, but I'm glad I didn't find out, and we are currently in the process of installing cameras. This had to have been somebody that lives nearby and can monitor how often we are there. Update. We did catch a car pulling in like it was scoping the place out, and the people inside never got out, but they left. We asked a few of my fiancé's family members about it, and that was to our detriment. One of them went and spread the word that we have cameras, and somebody in the neighborhood who owned the vehicle that we caught on camera slipped up and said that they had already knew things had been stolen. Which to me is basically a confession, because we hadn't told anybody about the robbery until the incident with the car we caught on camera. So now more people than necessary know, and we probably won't catch the person who did it. We still turned the footage into the police though, so maybe they can dig up some background info. I came home from work today to receive some very unsettling news from one of my roommates, and it all started when I went to let the dogs out into the yard. Our back door is in the kitchen, so on my way to let them out, I passed by the oven and noticed that it was on. It surprised me a bit because my roommate Mandy was the only other person home, and she had been spending most of her time back in her room due to feeling ill. Even so, I figured that I'd better ask her first before turning it off, on the off chance that she was actually using it. I went to the end of the hallway where her room was, knocked on her door and asked, "Hey, is the oven supposed to be on? Are you using it right now?" Confusion and concern was immediately apparent in her voice as she replied, "What? No, I haven't even been out in the kitchen today." I shared her confusion and concern upon hearing this, but then pondered the possibility that Carl, her brother and our other roommate, had been the one to leave it on by mistake. I asked her if this could be the case, and she told me that Carl was still at work and had been since early that morning. This was when she and I began to piece together that something very strange had to have happened. I told her that I had just gotten home a few minutes prior, and it was a little after 3 p.m. at that point. I had left the house at about 7:30 that morning. Then she informed me, with horrific realization, that at around 11 a.m., she had heard noises coming from the living room, including a woman's voice, a chair moving, and the front door opening. She didn't realize at the time that I was at work, so she just assumed it was me and didn't think much of it. She then mentioned that in hindsight, the dogs were barking an unusual amount during this time. I asked her how long the noises coming from the living room went on, and she said that it was hard to tell because she was trying to sleep at the time, but that if she had to guess, they'd lasted about 20 minutes. Mandy, Carl and I are the only current residents of this home, and as mentioned before, Carl and I were both at work during that time frame, so Mandy was the only person who reasonably should have been in the house. I thanked her for informing me of this, and then went back to the front half of the house and did a quick comb of the area to check for anything else that looked out of place or missing. I didn't discover anything else out of the ordinary, and as of the time of this posting, nothing else has come of it. Update. It's pretty minor, but still pretty weird. I went to the hall closet to get more toilet paper for my bathroom, and I noticed an empty wrapper for a new pillow in there. But I hadn't bought a new pillow recently, so I asked both of my roommates if they had, and Mandy said she'd bought one about a month ago, but that she'd thrown the packaging away. This was my first time noticing the packaging in that hall closet, and I last went into the hall closet just a couple of weeks ago, if I remember correctly. Second update. New information and events have emerged that are almost certainly connected to this incident. Late last night, I woke up from a nap to find that Mandy and Carl were seemingly angry about something. They were initially in the living room, but after I'd walked in, I heard pounding and cussing, and I inferred from this that they were angry at me, and started wondering about the possible reason. In any case, a few minutes later, Carl walked out to the living room where I was and said, "Don't worry, we're not angry at you." Then he returned to Mandy's room and said, "I have something very important to tell you," before going in. Fast forward another short while later, and the two of them walked back into the living room, looking like they'd had something to talk to me about. They informed me that a source close to them had recently confirmed that there had indeed been someone who's been standing outside the house and watching our home at odd hours. They've yet to directly catch them in the act, but they can tell it's happening based on hearing noises and reactions from our dogs. There had been a few more strange instances in the past few days leading up to this, first on being when I woke up from an after-work nap one night and went into the living room to find that all the lights had been unplugged and the bulbs loosened. I also found that the lock on the door leading out to the garage had been jammed. Then a little while later, whilst I was in the kitchen making dinner, I found that the microwave and the toaster oven were both also unplugged. The lights being unplugged thankfully turned out to have an innocent explanation, which was just Carl trying to save on the electric bill. But when I asked him about the microwave and toaster oven, he had no idea. He said he hadn't done that, and he didn't think Mandy had either. He tried to say that they must have come unplugged by accident, but frankly I very much doubt that. The part of the wall where they're plugged in is a little corner that gets virtually no hand traffic, so to speak. And on top of that, the microwave plug is thick and sturdy. Certainly not the type to accidentally come unplugged just from someone bumping it with their hand. So with all that considered, the idea that they could have come unplugged by accident simply wasn't plausible. As for the lock on the door to the garage being jammed, that had the creepiest explanation of all. I had forgotten to ask about it at the time that I was asking about the stuff being unplugged, but they ended up bringing it up last night when they were filling me in on everything else. They told me that they had found the door out in the garage that leads to the backyard unlocked. None of us have used that door in months, so someone had undoubtedly picked the lock and gotten into the garage at the very least. Their discovery of this led to them to take the extra precaution of double locking the door that leads to the garage from indoors. Mandy also brought up to me an extra chilling detail about the previous incident that she had forgotten to mention until then. You may recall that one of the sounds she'd heard coming from the living room was a woman's voice. Well, she informed me that the voice she heard sounded a lot like mine, and on top of that, it sounded muffled, as though it was coming from a recording. This means that there is a very real possibility, even likelihood, that whoever was behind this incident had somehow obtained a recording of my voice and was purposefully using it to make it seem as though I was the one in the living room at the time. They even seemed to have an idea about who it was, but remained vague about it, presumably not wanting to jump to any conclusions. I was able to gather that they definitely believe it to be a man. However, upon further discussion, we came to the conclusion that there are likely multiple people involved. A theory we all had to varying degrees was that Carl's ex, Ashley, is behind this in some way. She and Carl had a very nasty breakup last summer, and she's displayed unhinged behaviour towards him and Mandy ever since, including breaking in on 2 separate occasions. After the second time, Carl finally got a protective order against her, but that hasn't stopped her from seemingly trying to get around it. She hasn't directly shown up during times that we're home, but she has been texting both of them from unknown numbers on and off a few times, and even managed to hack their Facebook accounts just a couple of months ago. On top of all that, Carl has confirmed that Ashley does indeed know how to pick locks. I also noticed and pointed out that all the major incidents seem to be occurring during times I'm not home, and brought up the suggestion that this could be deliberate. One of my friends who I had described the situation to had said that if this person is indeed deliberately carrying out their acts when I specifically wasn't home, it likely indicates that their vendetta is only against Mandy and Carl, and they do not want me involved in the crossfires. That lends credence to the theory of Ashley being involved. For all her anger and erratic behaviour towards Mandy and Carl, she never had a single negative interaction with me personally. She showed fondness for me, and we parted ways without any hard feelings after Carl ended things. When I explained all this to Mandy and Carl, they found that it made a lot of sense. As for the reason we believe there are multiple people involved, as previously mentioned, the person who's been the main one watching our house seems to be a man. But the one actually picking the locks and entering is most likely Ashley herself, or maybe one of her female friends, since they would have light enough tread to more effectively slip in and out secretly. A lot of this is still speculation, but given all the circumstantial evidence, I have a feeling we're not far off with our intuition of what's happening. This incident happened about 5 years ago, and this is a story that I never really tell anymore, because most people are either uncomfortable hearing it or make well-meaning comments about what I should have done in this situation without really understanding how differently your mind works when you're experiencing absolute panic. But you guys seem to get it, so here's my story. I was living in a relatively nice apartment in downtown Memphis, working as an ophthalmic technician. I arrived home from work at my usual time, which was about 4:30 p.m, unlocked my door and went inside. I set my phone, wallet and keys on the kitchen island, hearing my heavy metal front door swing shut loudly behind me. Then I began taking care of some errands around the house. Having grown up in a small town, it was habit for me to not lock my door during the day, especially when I knew my husband would be home soon anyway, and I've never forgotten to lock my door once in the 5 years since this day. I walked through my bathroom and into my large walk-in closet and began hanging up the laundry that I'd started earlier in the day before work, when my front door opened. I smiled with surprise. My husband was home a little early, and I happily called out to him, "I'm in here, love." But I was met with silence, and slowly began getting a sinking feeling of something's wrong crawl up my spine. I tried to shake it off, thinking my husband simply hadn't heard me, and walked out into my living room kitchen area. Standing on the other side of my kitchen island was a complete stranger. He was male, older than me. I would estimate 50s, but it's hard for me to recall any exact facial features or details from this moment, and he was just standing there staring at me. No ski mask, no weapon, just watching me. I wondered if he'd maybe walked into the wrong apartment and was going to apologize and leave. But as he continued to stare, I realized I needed to do something other than just gape at this stranger in my house. I stood taller, puffed up my chest in an attempt to look more threatening, which is hard to do as a small female, and used a loud, clear voice telling him to get out of my apartment and that he had no business being here. He completely ignored me, like I hadn't spoken. Then he began to pick up my things, my cell phone, my keys, my wallet, and he picked them up methodically and put them in his own pockets. I darted forward towards the only other device I had that would allow me to get help, which was my computer, but I had to take a few steps closer to the intruder in order to reach it, but still had about 12 to 15 feet between us, so I knew I could grab it and run before he could reach me. As I picked it up and turned to run, I saw him start to move after me, so I sprinted back towards the bathroom because it was the only place I could go and put 2 locked doors between us, my bathroom door and the closet door. I slammed and locked the first door, and within seconds I could hear him messing with it, trying to open it. I ran into the closet and locked that door too, opening my computer and getting on Facebook Messenger to contact my husband. I sent message after message, pleading with him to call 911 and tell them there was an intruder in the apartment. He got the messages within minutes and assured me that he had a dispatcher on the phone and was leaving for work himself to try and get to me if he could. I waited and waited. When the bathroom door opened and the intruder came inside, he moved to the closest door and started trying to break that door down too. And here's the part where people usually start giving me advice on how I should have acted. But all I can tell you is that I was frozen. With fear. With shock. I don't know. But I didn't scream or cry or search for a weapon in that dark closet. I didn't brace the door or try to hold it closed. I just kneeled in my closet and waited to die, because I just knew that's what was going to happen. People like to tell me that I lived in an apartment, so surely if I'd screamed, someone would have heard and come to help. Surely there was something heavy enough in my closet to use to defend myself. Hell, even the laptop I had would hurt if I swung it at someone. Why didn't I do anything? I don't really have an answer for that, but the closet door miraculously held. I heard frustrated footsteps go back out into the living area of my apartment, and I heard things breaking, bottles shattering, my drawers and refrigerator and cabinets being flung open as things were torn out of them, and I continued to sit in that closet, silently crying, wanting to leave but feeling that death was inevitable. I feel awful about my selfishness in that moment, but I messaged my mum, who lived a 15 hours drive away, and told her what was happening. I desperately wanted comfort and to tell her how much I loved her. I'm not a parent, but I can only imagine the fear and helplessness I put her through, knowing her daughter was in danger and there was nothing she could do to help. She messaged me constantly, begging me to keep replying. I told her I would as long as I could, but I also told her to tell my brothers I loved them and to help my husband through whatever happened next if it ended badly for me. The intruder started messing with the closet door again, mumbling disjointed words that I couldn't really distinguish, and I remember hoping that the police would get to the apartment before my husband, so that he wouldn't be the one to find me in whatever state this invader left me in. The front door opened again then, and it was my husband shouting for me. The intruder walked out towards the living room kitchen area again, where my front door was located, and I opened the door and darted from the closet to find my husband on the ground with him, pinning him in place. The man kept mumbling, at times yelling, but never really put up much resistance. This entire part is a blur for me, but I remember feeling like the room was spinning, filled with fear mostly for my husband at this point. Eventually the police found the apartment, and it had taken them about 25 minutes to arrive, which still blows my mind. I know time seems to move slowly during scary situations, so I thought it was less than that. But from the time my husband dialed 911 to the time officers arrived, it was 25 excruciating minutes. Now this isn't intended to bash them in any way. It just always seemed like this was unusually long response time for a home invasion. They got my things back from the man and took him out of my apartment. Then I numbly went through the process of filing a police report, telling them what had happened. One of the officers commented that I should really keep my door locked at all times, and I remember feeling like he was being insensitive at the time, or blaming me for what happened, but later recognized his words were coming from experience. I'm sure he's seen this situation end differently for other women. Within 30 minutes, the scariest incident of my life was over, but I've carried the fear, the violation, the anxiety of having someone intrude in my space for years. If it happened to me once, it could happen again. If this or something similar has happened to you, and you're still struggling with the aftermath of it, the sleepless nights, the laying awake listening for sounds of forced entry, the nightmares, the constant checking and rechecking your locks, this is what eventually helped me. A year after this took place, my husband and I moved to the Midwest for his job. We selected a safe town with a nice apartment complex and chose a third-floor apartment with only one point of entry. I looked up every statistic on crime for the neighborhood, finding that an isolated incident of car theft was the only thing reported in decades. I still couldn't sleep at night though, but it was definitely better than staying in the same apartment in Memphis. My husband often works night shifts now, and I simply couldn't continue being terrified to sleep at night. I realized my biggest fear wasn't that something could happen again, but that if it did, I was just as unprepared now as I was then. I hadn't changed anything, other than locking my door, and I knew I would likely freeze up again, and leave my life up to being able to hide well enough, or having a door long enough to save me, and that was unacceptable. I walked into a martial arts school with an excellent self-defense program, introduced myself, and started talking classes. At first I was quiet, hiding in the back of the room and generally keeping to myself. My instructor, who was both incredibly kind and incredibly insightful, slowly built up my confidence and brought me out of my bubble of fear. After several months of training, I finally shared my reason for taking classes with him, and he's worked with me tirelessly to give me the ability to protect myself in any environment. I've been training for years now, and the difference it has made in every aspect of my life is unbelievable. The meek, quiet girl that waited to die in her closet doesn't exist. I am confident, I am strong, I am worthy of living and protecting myself in my home. I no longer am ashamed of how I handled the situation I was in, but I also understand what steps I can take to ensure that I'm safe. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but it was worth it. I recognize this might not be a solution or option for everyone. Your experience is valid, and however you decide to cope with your own story is the right choice for you. This is how I happened to do it, and it's worked well for me. Thank you again for listening. I'm a little afraid to share this, but I'm not sure how people will respond. But maybe doing so will help someone else that's feeling alone with this. If anyone is struggling with their own story and wants a kind ear to listen, I'm here. Stay safe out there. My husband and I live in an apartment building that have 4 apartments, 2 on the first floor and 2 on the top, and all are identical 3-bedroom layouts. We live on the top floor. Shortly after we'd moved in, one of our downstairs neighbours told us that all of our keys are identical, so we can open each other's doors. He said when he'd learned this, he immediately got his locks changed. I was curious about this because I'm a very paranoid person. We're good friends with our neighbours across from us on the same floor, so I tried my mailbox key and theirs, and it worked. Not only that, I could open everyone else's mailboxes too. I then texted the neighbour and told her I'd done this, and explained that the keys are identical. With her permission, I tried to open the door to her apartment with our key, and it worked. Now, I don't much like the downstairs neighbours, so I don't feel comfortable asking them if I can test their locks. But nonetheless, this was an unsettling find. On top of this, another downstairs neighbour, not the one that told me about the keys, the one across from him, is dating the building's maintenance guy. Now, he obviously has keys to all of the units, and that's always unsettled me, because the occupants of that unit aren't the best people, and I have worried before they'd steal his keys. Or to be honest, if they'd asked, I don't doubt he'd give them the keys voluntarily. So anyhow, with all that in mind, here are some bizarre occurrences. The first one occurred about 6 months ago, when my husband and I came home and I walked into our bathroom. A ton of random stuff had been thrown off the counter onto the floor, and this was weird because we don't have pets, neither of us did, and it was only about half of what was on the counter that ended up on the ground. We sweeped our place and didn't find anyone, but I really didn't like it. The weirdest occurrence was about 4 months ago. My husband wasn't home, and I was in one of our bathrooms, which is on the far end of the unit from the door. I was expecting my husband to be home, and I heard the door open and close. I was in the bathroom for about 20 more minutes doing my hair, and when I came out to see my husband, no one was home. I was totally alone, then my husband came home about 10 minutes later. I've been wondering since that last incident if someone had come in thinking we were both gone, as we share a car and my husband had it, but saw the light under the door to the bathroom, realized I was home and left. Super creepy, right? So this story took place when I was 6 or 7 years old, and my parents were out late at a bar. My older sister, who was 14 to 15 at the time, was watching me, and we were in the living room watching TV. It was fairly late at around 10 to 11 p.m, and we lived in a nice neighbourhood at the time. Police never had to come through or deal with lots of issues, and it had a low crime rate with great schools. We were both dozing off when suddenly it sounded like someone was trying to aggressively open our door, like as if someone was being chased and they were desperate for shelter. They were pounding on the glass, jiggling the doorknob and ringing the doorbell all at the same time, and were doing so very aggressively. It lasted for probably 10 to 15 seconds, and then abruptly stopped. My sister made me go up to the front door and see if it was Mum and Dad, possibly drunk, coming home, but it wasn't. There was no one there when I checked. So freaking out, we called our parents, who were only a little concerned, but said they were on their way. I remember us running upstairs and locking ourselves in my room, since the downstairs floor was full of giant windows that had the curtains open. 15 to 20 minutes later it happened again. Pounding, trying the doorknob, and non-stop rapidly ringing the doorbell. I was hoping that it was a ding-dong ditcher the first time, but twice. I would have thought you wouldn't want to go back to the same home in fear of having the cops called on you or having someone looking out for you, but I don't know. My sister called my parents again, who were still on their way home, and we were both too terrified to check the door. It stopped abruptly again, and I don't know why my sister didn't just call the cops herself. My parents got home then, and they still didn't know if it was worth calling the cops or not, in fear of it ending up being a waste of time. But obviously my parents aren't very smart, and since they weren't there, they didn't hear how crazy it had sounded. It wasn't just a knock and a doorbell ring. Whoever was on the other side of the door was putting what sounded like all of their strength into trying to get into our house. We all went to bed with my mum assuring us that it wouldn't happen again. But then 3 a.m. rolled around, and it did happen again. This time it was more aggressive. My mum screamed to my dad to call 911, which he did whilst running downstairs to see who it was. Then it stopped. My dad got to the door probably 5 seconds after it did, but nobody was there. The cops patrolled our house that night and drove around the neighbourhood often for a few days after those incidents. And from what I know, nobody else has reported something like this happening to them in our neighbourhood before. Still don't know what it could have been about, and I always told myself it was just some kids messing with us. But the fact it happened multiple times and was so aggressive just disturbed me. I had trouble sleeping in that house for months afterwards. If you wanted to ding-dong ditch, why would you try to open the door relentlessly? And why target the same house 3 times? That just seems like a lot. God knows what would have happened if the door had been unlocked. We were little girls and definitely wouldn't have been able to defend ourselves had it been malicious. Our cars were broken into a couple of months after this too, so it's possible that it could have been related, but I'll never know. Whether it was innocent or not, whoever desperately wanted to get into our home that night, thanks for the lifelong trauma of being home alone. Growing up, my dad's nickname for me was always pendeja, which for those of you who don't know, roughly translates into dumbass. I've always kind of embraced the name, because I am known for doing silly, ridiculous things. However, this naivety reared its ugly head this evening. My boyfriend and I have been on uncertain terms for the last couple of weeks. He usually stays at my house, since I don't have any roommates, but tonight he wanted to go home. We've been texting all night, talking about how much we'd missed each other, when all of a sudden I heard a knock at the door. At this point I feel it's important to explain that I am a complete junkie for true crime. I'm not a big fan of watching TV, but I love reading about true crime. And with this hobby of mine, I always imagined that, if placed in an uncertain situation, I would react intelligently. I should also note that my birthday was just a couple of days ago, and being on uncertain terms, my boyfriend and I were not together. With this in mind, I thought that maybe he would surprise me tonight. Now for the story. I was standing in the kitchen with my 14-month-old, 75-pound Australian Shepherd dog when I heard a knock at the door. Being incredibly foolish, I decided to open the door thinking it was my boyfriend. But while I was ready to jump into his arms, there was some part of me that felt I should protect myself. I wedged my foot in such a way that I felt confident no one could push me, and at the time I knew my Aussie, who was trained to sit near the front door but not come up excitedly, was right by my side. So as I excitedly expected to embrace my boyfriend, I eagerly opened the door. But instead of it being my loving boyfriend, I was met with a man holding my storm door open, meaning the barrier I would normally expect to be between me and the stranger no longer protected me. Not only was a man there though, but a woman who appeared to be in her early 20s was there too. She was holding a bundle that in my opinion was a crude attempt at mimicking a child, but unfortunately for them, I am aware of what a swaddled baby looks like and must have changed my demeanour. Before I even had time to process what was going on, or for the gentleman in front of me to start his spiel, my 75-pound Australian Shepherd was at the door. As the man began to explain the situation, my dog lunged through the crack of the door, snarling at them like I've never heard him do before. Now, I've always known my dog was a protector. We have spent lots of time camping in locations where he was able to hear people off in the distance, so whenever he would hear someone, he would walk to the edge of his leash and point. Once he was done pointing, he would simply sit down, staring in the direction of the disturbance. So needless to say, I've always known he has my back, and to see him lunging forward the moment the man began to speak really freaked me out. I'll admit I had been drinking, and my reflexes weren't as impressive as they could have been, but my dog was able to slip out of the front door to about his hip height, all the while snarling like a beast. The moment my dog stuck his head outside, both people turned and backed away, and as they left they were almost in sync when they said, "Never mind, I'm so sorry to bother you." They kept repeating this until I was able to grab my dog and force him back inside, closing the door on these strangers. I genuinely feel like I fell for something dangerous by opening the door, and if it hadn't been for my dog looking out for me, who knows what would have happened. Always keep an eye out for weird people knocking on your door after dark, and please be smarter than I was. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.